problem. Anyways, the reason I'm telling you about that is because after the peasants were granted their land and started to become farmers, a tiny minority of them became extremely successful, and those people produced almost all of the food for Russia and the Ukraine. So what happened in the 1920s when bloody Lenin came along and collectivized the farms was that they defined the kulaks, who were these tiny minority of successful farmers who maybe had a brick house and were able to hire a couple of people and had some land and some livestock and were very productive people. They defined them as socially unfriendly elements, and they sent groups of intellectuals out into the towns to collectivize the farms. And so the idea was that, well, you would pool your land and everyone would farm it collectively, and the land was taken away, of course, from the tiny minority of people who were actually productive and had actually managed to own much of the land. So you have to imagine how that would occur. Okay, so it's in the 1920s, it's after World War I, Russia's in pretty bad shape, the villages are full of brutalized men who have post-traumatic stress disorder, and lots of people who are not doing well at all. And the bloody intellectuals come into the town and they say, you know those successful farmers up the street that you've always been pretty jealous about in your useless manner? Well, they're actually pigs and demons who are stealing from you, so why don't you come out, we'll form a nice little mob and we'll take everything they've got. And that's exactly what happened. And all those people were killed or raped or set off to Siberia in the middle of the bloody winter where there wasn't even anything for them anywhere for them to live or anything for them to eat. So they all died. And then the consequence of that was a few years later, 6 million people starved to death in the Ukraine. And Malcolm Muggeridge had been reporting on that since the 1930s. And so that was the first wind, really, that the West got of exactly what was happening in the Soviet Union. But even at that point, the bloody left-wing intellectuals in North America were so damn clueless, and in Europe, that they never paid much attention to it, with the exception of a certain number of people like George Orwell, who wrote 1984 and Animal Farm, which is, of course, a discussion. The main pig in Animal Farm is Stalin, of course, and it's a story, an allegory about the Russian Revolution, whose basic motif is we're all equal, but of course all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And that's the motif of Animal Farm. So there had been warnings all the way through, right from the beginning of the Russian Revolution, to the West about exactly what was going on. But because communist and Marxist ideology is very good at addling the weak minds of idiot intellectuals, there was a huge section of the population who was fomenting, I suppose, against the standard, what would you call it, political, psychological, and social order, who were absolutely committed to, you know, the ethic that's encased in statements like from each according to his ability to each according to his need, which sounds perfectly wonderful if you think about it for about 15 seconds, but if you think about it for 6 months, becomes unbelievably murderous in its reach and intent. And so, anyways, the French, for whatever reason, seem to be particularly opaque to reason. I'll give you an example. So the doctrine of Pol Pot in Cambodia that also killed about 6 million people. So what they did in Cambodia once the revolution occurred was decide that everyone in the city were parasites on the countryside, because the countryside full of farmers was where the primary production was taking place, and they regarded the city dwellers as parasites on that fundamental production. So they basically emptied out the cities and sent all the people in the cities out to work in the country as forced labor, and 6 million people died there. And the chief architect of that bloody project got his PhD from the Sorbonne and said exactly what he was going to do when he went back to Cambodia, was cheered along by the French intellectuals who thought that that was just a fine idea. So that's all background for why